On this episode of the Moctober series, we're cutting open the Danner bull runs to see if they're bullshit. And I think I've figured out what I want to do for that 300,000 subscriber goal mark. So if we reach 300,000 subscribers by the end of this year, I want to give away 30 pairs of boots to you guys, 30 pairs of boots to my local homeless community, and give away $3,000 store credit to however many people that divvies out to. So if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. It makes a huge difference and will help me reach that goal and do some good in my community, give some boots to you guys. And if you are subscribed, thanks for all your support and watching the videos, liking the videos, and commenting on the videos. So the reason for the title of this video is I saw a Reddit post a few years ago that was titled like Bull Runs or Bull or something like that. And I kind of wrote them off in my head. I never really researched these shoes after that. I never really did any digging past it. I just kind of wrote them off, which is a terrible thing to do. And so when Moctober started coming around, people started requesting these like crazy. I was like, oh, finally, we'll get to tear these boots apart and really see what's going on inside of them, because these boots are built really differently than the other boots that we're going to be reviewing. They're pretty unique in a few ways. And so now let's kind of go through some of those details. And well, I guess first let's talk about the information on these boots. So the brand is Danner. The model is the Bull Run Moc Toe. I've got the brown leather. They retail for $190 on their site. They go up to about $210 depending on which leather and if you're getting the steel toe or just the soft toe. I forgot to weigh the Red Wings last time, but I'm gonna add that into this series as well. So the Danners weigh 1 pound, 9 ounces. The Red Wings weighed 1 pound, 12 ounces. And these are made in the US with imported parts, which basically, I'll add their little description. I won't cover toast, I'll put it over here on their site of what that means. But basically, they have parts of this boot made overseas, and then the final building and construction of the boot happens in their Portland, Oregon factory. So now let's kind of get to some of those interesting construction techniques and things that make these different from, I think, pretty much all the other boots that we're going to be doing in this series. So starting with maybe the most obvious is the construction type. So most of the other boots that we've seen, and I think all the other mock toe boots that we're going to do, are a Goodyear welted construction, where these Danner bull runs are a stitched down construction. So what's the difference, or how is it different? Well, in a Goodyear welted construction, you've got a separate piece of leather that wraps all the way around the boot that is sewn to the upper, and then that strip of leather called the welt is stitched to the sole. But with a stitched down construction, there's no separate piece of leather that makes up the welt. The actual upper itself is just flanged out, and then that is stitched to the sole or the midsole. So there's some pros and cons associated with it. The cons are it's a lot harder to get the longevity out of this style of boot, because with a Goodyear welted boot, once you wear out that welt, or if you kick through that welt or wear it all the way out, you can always just sew a new welt on. But with these, the welt is basically the upper. So if you accidentally rub all the leather, the toe completely gone, there's no upper left to stitch to a resoled sole. So it has a potential to not last as long. You know, we've seen in boots like, oh geez, just dropping knives. Like the Nix Builder Pro, which is like the ultimate work boot, they still have a stitched down construction at their toe. If done right, it's still a really reliable boot, and it has its pros. For instance, like the Nix Builder Pros, they like doing a stitched down construction because it's a lot more water resistant, and you don't get a lot of dirt in between the welt and the upper. You know, because in a Goodyear welted boot, if you're doing a lot of work in dirt, some of that dirt can get in between the welt and the upper and slowly start wearing out the boot. And the biggest pro, for me at least, is it allows you to have a little bit more room in the toe box, and you're not standing on that rib and the welt the entire time you're wearing the boots. And that's maybe my biggest complaint with a Goodyear welted boot, is you're standing on that rib all day, every day. It doesn't have the same solid platform to equally break in your foot. Like your pinky toe and your big toe is always going to be resting on a little bit thicker of a material or harder of a material. So if you looked inside of a Goodyear welted boot, it's kind of bowed out a little bit. And then if you looked inside of a stitched down constructed boot, it's an equal platform to fully break into your foot, if that makes sense. Another con of a stitched down construction is you don't get that same tucked look, you don't get that slim profile. They're always going to have a little bit wider of a platform, which can be a positive. You know, if you want a really stable boot, the stitched down construction with that wider platform is going to give you a little bit more stability, but it's not going to give you that refined tucked look like you see in the Red Wings. Next, let's talk about the leather. So this is a full grain oil tanned leather, which is just a chrome tan leather with lots and lots of oils infused into it. And usually a good indicator of an oil tanned leather is it has that pull-up effect, which a lot of people really like because it kind of gives some depth to the color of the boots, and as it ages, it really adds some pretty patina over time. And for the thickness, so these boots are surprisingly thin. The leather is only 2 millimeters thick, whereas the Red Wings are 2.5 millimeters thick. So I'd say an average boot leather thickness is around 2.5 millimeters. So these are a little bit on the thinner side, and even up to like these Builder Pros, which are a dedicated heavy work boot, these are just over 3.5 millimeters wide or thick. So the leather is a little bit thinner on this, and that was one of the complaints I saw a few years ago, is that the leather was too thin. And even in Stridewise video of this review, and I'll put his video in the description because he's a really good guy that actually wears the boots for an extended period of time and can give a more informed review on that end of it. But in that video, he said the thickness was 1.5 millimeters, which is even thinner. And that's around the thickness of what we'd see in like a high quality leather sneaker. And there are also pros and cons associated with that. You know, a thinner leather is going to be more breathable for the summer, and I think these boots are more centered around a summertime work boot or light work boot. If it was anything under 2 millimeters, I'd be a little bit more concerned, but it is worth noting that it is a little bit thinner leather than usual. But as for the overall quality of the leather, it seems like it's a pretty decent leather. You know, it's not horrible. It's actually kind of a really pretty leather. It almost has a little bit of a purple hue to it. Next to the outsole, so this is a foam rubber outsole, or like kind of air infused rubber outsole. It's really similar to the Vibram Christie, which I think they used to use, but it's a little bit lighter weight. And I think most companies move away from Vibram because they can move it all in-house and maybe save a little bit of money, but also make the exact sole they want. Because this sole, compared to the Red Wing, the Red Wing's a lot more dense and it has more of an actual rubber feel. These Danners have a more foam feel and they're softer. So, you know, they're gonna wear out a lot faster, but they're gonna be more comfortable than like the Red Wings and the Vibram soles. So next is that big chunk of rubber for the midsole that the upper is flanged out and stitched to. I don't really know much about what this midsole is. I guess we'll have to see when we get it cut in half, but I think that makes up the entirety of the midsole. I don't think there's any cork or any other filling inside of there. And then to the inside, we can pull out their insert, maybe. It is removable, I'm just struggling with it. So it's an Ortholite insert, nothing fancy, just like a decent rubber or decent foam insert. And then underneath of that, it looks like it's a fiberboard insole. I don't really know quite yet, but I think the construction literally just goes the upper fiberboard, the hard rubber midsole, and then the foam rubber outsole. And I think that's all there is to it. Next to the overall look of these boots, so these boots are significantly wider looking than the Red Wings and even the Thorogoods. You know, they have kind of a more work-centered look to them, and part of that wider look is because of that stitched down construction. You know, you don't have that upper that's tucked and pulled underneath. It flanges out. And so it gives you that wider platform for wider feet, but it also gives you a wider look to it. One interesting thing about this is I think this toe actually might be hand sewn, because this reminds me a lot of like a hand sewing technique. And also worth noting is this toe is a two-part toe, just like the Red Wings and unlike the Thorogoods. So I think that pretty much wraps up all the preliminary information. So now we got to cut it apart. I'm really excited to cut these apart because I could not find anywhere what's on the inside of these or how they're built or really any information about this boot at all. So these are the ones I'm really excited to cut apart. And before we cut them apart, let's talk about Weaver, the sponsor of this video. So I've been a customer of Weaver Leather Supply basically since I started this company in 2015. I've bought tons of their equipment, tons of their tools, tons of supplies from them, you know, even down to this knife that I use on the channel and in our general everyday production, we use their machines. They're a really great company that have tons of resources and tons of supplies and equipment. They've got leather, they've got tools, they've got leather care, they've got hardware, everything you need for leather working or leather care, they've got it. And one really important thing with Weaver is they're a company you can trust. You know, it's a US-based company that's only selling the highest quality materials, and they know the suppliers they're working with. They work with the best tanneries, and so you don't have to worry about buying something off eBay, waiting 3 months for it to come from China and hope that it's decent quality. With Weaver, you know exactly what you're getting, and if you have any issues with it or if you have any problems or concerns, you can call them up and they actually know what they're talking about, because there's nothing more frustrating than calling up a company hoping that they can solve your problem and then you find out that you know more than they do. But with Weaver, they've got an entire dedicated team to answering your questions, solving your problems, because they're the ones that built half of the machines. So if you're thinking about leatherworking, you started leatherworking, or you're a professional leatherworker like us, Weaver's a really great resource for you, and they're giving you a 10% discount. So you can save 10% site-wide on any order by using the code ROSEANVIL. So thanks to Weaver Leather for sponsoring this video. Make sure you check them out via the link in my description, and don't forget to use that discount code. But now let's cut these bad boys up. Well, there's definitely a shank in here, so let's see what's inside. So I really didn't expect to see a shank in here, because a lot of these mock toes aren't gonna have a shank because they don't necessarily need one, because there's no heel in this wedge sole. Because most of the time you see a shank in a boot or a shoe, it's to add a little bit of stability in that gap that's caused by a heel. But since these are wedge soles, there's no gaps, there's no need for a shank unless it's a more work-centered boot, kind of like these Danners are. And in a work-centered boot, you'll have a shank in here to add a little bit of extra stability to the shoe, and more importantly, anytime you're gonna be hitting a shovel or climbing a ladder or a telephone pole, and all the weight of your body is centered on the arch of your foot, it's really nice to have that shank in there to add a little bit of extra stability and spread the weight of that pressure out amongst the entire platform of the boot. So it makes sense that it's in there. I didn't expect to see it. And as for the construction, we can really see better now how simple this construction is and how it's all structured. So let's quickly go through the layers. It's literally just the outsole, that thick hard rubber midsole, the fiberboard insole, and then the upper, and then a little bit of a liner that's tucked underneath of the insole. And one thing that I was curious about was if this toe was hand stitched, because it has that look of a hand stitched stitch line. And a good way to tell is just by pulling the threads and see if they interlock, kind of like a seam on a shirt does, or do the threads weave in and out. So if you pull this out, we can see that they aren't interlocked, they're just weaved. So I'm pretty sure that the toe on this boot is hand stitched. which I think is a really nice handmade touch to it. I wonder if that's part of what's done in Oregon or if that's done overseas when they import the parts. Because that's a pretty laborious process, hand stitching the toe of a boot. You know, we hand stitch all of the wallets and it takes forever. It's significantly slower than machine stitching, but it's a lot stronger. So I really like that aspect of it, because I'm pretty sure the Red Wings aren't hand stitched. I guess I never checked, but I also didn't know it was a possibility. So let's try the Red Wings. The Red Wings are not hand stitched. So I really like that aspect of this boot. And then the counter material is kind of like a reinforced felted material. And it's pretty flexible. I don't think it's gonna break on you unless you're really putting a lot of pressure on this over and over and over. You know, sometimes we see some of those plastic counters that if you bend it once, it'll break. Sometimes we see it in like cheap sneakers. So at least it's not that, but it's not quite as nice as a leather counter like we saw in the Red Wings. And one thing that is kind of a bummer is the counter cover on the inside is just the fabric liner. You know, a lot of times you see in boots where they'll do a separate piece of leather flesh out that kind of helps grab and grip the heel of your heel as you're wearing it, so you don't get the blisters on your heel, and it adds an extra layer of protection. I just don't think that a fabric counter cover is going to last nearly as long. So I'm really surprised in a more work-centered boot that they would put a fabric counter cover on there. So now to the big question, are the Danner Bull Runs bullshit? We'll start with construction. So construction-wise, I don't see any issues in here. I think a lot of people are going to be a fan of the stitch down style because of that wider platform, more room for your toes, a more equal break-in of the footprint. But material-wise, you don't really have much in the midsole to really have your foot break into, and the overall quality of these materials are just okay. But the one thing that's really cause for concern for me is that the liner is the counter cover. Because that's a point where you're going to see a lot of stress, and I could see how that would be one of the first things to break. You know, I wouldn't write this boot off. I still think it's a really good boot with a few issues here and there, because everything in this shoe is built for a lightweight, light duty work boot. And I think that's exactly what it is, and I think that's how they advertise it. So for that reason, I don't think it's bullshit. I think it's a fine boot. If you decide to go with this boot, I think you'll be just happy with it, unless you're really working in it. If you're really working in it, you might have some issues with it. And let me know what you guys think of these boots. Do you think they're good or BS? And just write BS in the comment section, because if you swear in the comment section, it gets flagged, and then my spam or held for review folder is just gonna be full of verdicts. But I'm really curious what you guys think. And if you've owned these boots, let me know of your experience with them, and if you thought they're worth it. So that wraps up the Danner Bull Runs. And next on Sunday will be the Carhartt Moc Toes, and then after that is the Thorogoods. So stay tuned for that. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. And if you are subscribed, do me a favor and hit the like button and leave a comment on if you think they're BS or not. We'll see you on Sunday. See ya.